So I recently stumbled upon a video that somehow has a really bold title and a really cautious title at the same time. The video is called Why There's Most Likely No God. In this video, I'm going to engage with that video and offer my suggestions.
So, if you're talking about scientists, one of the first scientists you're ever going to think of, if you talk to a layman about science, is going to be Albert Einstein. Everybody knows Albert Einstein's name. Everybody in the world would seem like. And Albert Einstein is often thought of as a religious man because he uses the word God a lot in his writings. A handwritten letter sold for $3 million on eBay, which clearly states, though, that Einstein does not believe in God. In the letter, he wrote, "The word God is for me nothing more than the expression and product of human weakness. The Bible, a collection of honorable but still primitive legends, which are nevertheless pretty childish." Some folks have issues with the translation of this message and the truth of its validity, but the letter did sell for $3 million on eBay, so there are people who believe that this is a real opinion of one of the most famous scientists ever.
First of all, I don't know anything about what Albert Einstein thought about God. But to tell you the truth, I don't really care. Because, first of all, Albert Einstein is not the person you should be turning to answer the question if God exists. You shouldn't turn to a scientist at all because science can't tell us anything about whether or not God exists. Science is a tool for studying the material world. But as anyone who believes in God will tell you, if God exists, he's not a material being. He's an immaterial being. So trying to use science to discover whether or not God exists is like trying to find a piece of wood, like a wood sculpture at the beach with a metal detector. You're using the wrong tool. What you need to use is philosophy. You have to turn to philosophy to find out whether or not God exists. So even if Albert Einstein is a smart man, he's not a philosopher, so he's not the one you should be turning to at all.
Another famous scientist, one of the most famous ones still alive today, is Stephen Hawking. In his 1988 book, A Brief History of Time, Hawking writes, "Then we should know the mind of God." This is something that's said a lot when it comes to Hawking. But Mr. Hawking said during an interview, "What I meant by we would know the mind of God is we would know everything that God would know if there were a God, which there isn't. Also, I'm an atheist." He was very explicit about his opinions, and he added, "Religion believes in miracles, but these are not compatible with science."
So Hawking is one that I do know for sure. He definitely was an atheist. But again, these aren't the people we should be asking if God exists. We shouldn't turn to scientists, we should turn to philosophers. And even aside from that point, this whole idea that we can determine whether or not a question is true by just citing the answers of famous smart people falls into what's known as the fallacy of the argument from authority. Sometimes authority can give us good information, but just assuming that something's true because a smart person said it is a fallacy. We have to actually think through these questions ourselves.
So is there scientific proof of no God? No, there's not. There's not any scientific proof that there was or wasn't, as we said before.
Some people might disagree with that claim that science can't tell us whether or not God exists, or at least if it can, it hasn't done that yet. Personally, I'm not convinced by those arguments. There's arguments for God like the fine-tuning argument or the Kalam cosmological argument, which try to use scientific discoveries to show that God exists. The watchmaker argument, Paley's watchmaker argument would be another one of those. I don't find those kinds of arguments very convincing. Myself, I prefer the metaphysical arguments of people like Thomas Aquinas, which don't rely on scientific discoveries. Instead, they rely on basic common sense principles and logic. So Thomas Aquinas' argument for motion, for example, proceeds from the existence of change in the world, something that we can all see with our own eyes. It's not something that science has to tell us exists. And it leads through logical analysis to the conclusion that there must exist something which is unchanging in order for change to be real. So I'm not sure if I even agree with this premise that the way that we should look at these questions is through science.
But there is definitely room to imagine a divine character. Science has not revealed why the universe came into existence, what preceded the Big Bang, and so on and so forth. But there is historical proof that some of the religious figures that we talk about in relation to God existed. But First, let's talk about one of the most famous ones, at least here in the United States, and that is Jesus. Jesus is in the Bible, absolutely, 100%. But outside of specific religious texts from after his death, there doesn't seem to be any historical evidence that Jesus existed.
So this bugs me, because what he's saying is that if you exclude the New Testament, there's nothing that we have that suggests that Jesus existed. Well, you can't just do that. You can't just ignore 4 biographies dated within decades of Jesus' life, which are like full biographies of the man's life, which show that, for one thing, he exists. And he might say, well, those are the 4 Gospels. They're obviously from a Christian source. Well, all biographies have a bias. What historians have to do is sort through where the bias is active and where, like, what we can know from just reading the biography, what we can know for sure. And there are very, 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 very few reputable historians who even consider the idea that Jesus was not a real historical figure because we have so much evidence that he exists. Paul was writing within, I think, like some of his letters, like a decade of Jesus' life. Are you just going to say that he's making this stuff up? I think I've heard it once. It's like 5 historians with degrees in that field who think that Jesus did not exist. It's a very small number because it's just abundantly obvious based on our historical data that Jesus existed, unless you decide to not treat the New Testament as historical documents for whatever reason.
The Romans kept track of everything, and I do mean everything. They weren't a huge empire with no organizational scheme. They had bureaucracy. They had all of these public buildings with records and construction records and military records and so on and so forth. We know what time of day Mount Vesuvius erupted because there are records that survive to this day that said so. It was lunchtime. You'd think we'd have tons of stories about a magical prophet guy who can walk on water, come back from the dead, heal the sick, and cure the lame, but there doesn't seem to be any verifiable primary source proof of this man's existence.
We know what time Mount Vesuvius erupted because the eruption of Mount Vesuvius was immediately seen as a major event that affected the lives of thousands and thousands of people because it killed thousands and thousands of people, and the whole nation was in an uproar about it. Jesus was a small providential figure in one of the smallest Roman provinces, and yeah, he had a following during his life of, some couple thousand at one point, but we wouldn't really expect there to be detailed records of his life because of how small and humble and insignificant a life he lived from an outside perspective. Someone like a Roman wouldn't see Jesus as an important person, just another Jewish rabbi. And for the record, we do have sources, non-Christian sources from that time confirming the existence of Jesus of Nazareth. Josephus, for example, was a famous Jewish historian who wrote about Jesus and said, quote, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following among both Jews and many of Greek origins. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of principal men among us, the Jews, condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him. And the tribe of Christians, so named for him, are not extinct at this day." So Josephus was a Jewish scholar who believed that Jesus existed, even though he didn't believe that Jesus was the Christ. And again, I don't know why it's important to have non-Christian historical figures reporting that Jesus existed, but if you want those, they exist.
That being said, historians would probably tell you there are a lot of secondary sources. Letters written from people, by other people, to other people, things talking about Jesus. But nothing that says, "Hello, I am Jesus, and here is my writings." Nothing that says, "Hello, this is Jesus, and me and Jesus are chilling out." Nothing that they can show as a primary source.
Yeah, because Jesus didn't write anything down. Neither did Socrates. Are we going to say that Socrates didn't exist? All we know about Socrates comes from his most prominent follower, Plato. Are we going to say the same thing about Socrates that this guy here is trying to say about Jesus? That because we only have writings from his followers, therefore the guy didn't exist? Are we going to say now that Socrates was never on trial in Athens because the only account of this historical event we have is from a guy who was biased towards Socrates? That doesn't make sense.
I was surprised by this. I imagine you're also surprised by this if you haven't done this research before. We have tons of art and books and documentation from before, during, and after the lifetime of Jesus, if he allegedly lived, but we don't have anything about this very important person.
We don't have anything about him if you exclude the 4 biographies written within a couple decades of his death, by one of them by someone who's claiming to be an eyewitness. But I guess if we want to ignore that, then we can say that there's nothing written about him from the time of his life.
The only real references to Jesus that we have are by his friends. And of course, they all wrote very positive things. If he was this incredible dude, don't you think there would be countertexts or supporting evidence or, evidence defaming him, especially considering he was a pretty polarizing bro?
But if he had friends, he needs to exist. So if you're going to say that Jesus didn't exist, how can you say that he had friends? It might sound like a silly point, but when you really think about it, you have to look at what his argument is. His argument is Jesus can't exist because the only people who wrote about him were his friends. Therefore, he doesn't exist. I'm not seeing the reason.
Alternatively, Buddha is widely agreed to be a real guy named Siddhartha Gautama. And scholars and historians all kind of agree on this. He probably lived around 500 BCE, and that's before Jesus. And there are biographies, there are accounts, there are ancient texts, all that cross-reference to this same Siddhartha Gautama. He gave his people the word of God, so if you believe that Siddhartha Gautama is a messiah of God or is telling you about God, teaching you about God, and you believe he's real and what he is saying is real, then God is real to you for that reason. Which also sheds a little more doubt on whether or not Jesus could be in a real place. Nobody wrote about him. Muhammad has records. Jesus doesn't. It's very strange.
Again, you can only say that no one wrote about Jesus if you exclude all the people who wrote about him, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, etc. Those people. So I don't think this argument is a very good one to say that just because the only people who wrote about Jesus were his friends, therefore he doesn't exist. It would be like if the only people who wrote biographies about me were only people who said they knew me. That would mean I didn't exist. I don't see the connection. As for the point about Buddha, yeah, I don't deny that Buddha exists. My reason for being not a Buddhist isn't that I don't believe that there was a man who was the Buddha. No, I just think that he was wrong in his philosophy and his theology and the way he saw the world. I don't think the same thing about Jesus. And if he wanted, I could give arguments for why I think that we can trust Jesus when he says that he is God. And I think we can give historical reasons for why we can know that he rose from the dead and therefore vindicated his claim to be God. And that's why I trust what he says.
But all that aside, just because Jesus did or did not exist does not mean that God does or does not exist. We're not trying to say that. What we're trying to say is that it does cast doubt on the whole religion thing from a scientific standpoint. It doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't a prophet, wasn't a messiah. It doesn't mean that Jesus was or was not anything. What we're saying is it's difficult to prove that he was really there in the same way. And there are still people working on finding that proof, and maybe we'll find it someday, maybe we'll find something interesting in the future, but as of right now, we don't really have any primary sources.
Except, again, the 4 biographies of Jesus, written within decades of his life. If we don't call those primary sources, then fine, we don't have primary sources. But if we don't call those primary sources, we have to reject a lot of historical primary sources. I mean, I remember when I took a history class, about a history class of the ancient world about a year and a half ago. One thing that was remarkable is how so much of things we take for granted, historical events like the battle at Thermopylae, our earliest records for those are decades and decades later. We have better testament for Jesus' life than events like those. Now, obviously, that doesn't prove Christianity is true. It just proves that it's really hard to say that Jesus didn't exist, which seems to be his implication. So to wrap up my points, first, we shouldn't be surprised if science doesn't say anything about whether or not God exists, because the existence of God is not a scientific question. Second, it's not a slam dunk to point out that smart people say that God does not exist, because that is an argument from authority, which is the weakest kind of argument. In fact, sometimes it's a fallacy. And third, just because the only historical records we have of Jesus are from his friends, that does not prove that he does not exist. In fact, the fact that the man had friends proves, or at least highly suggests, that he exists. And unless we want to dismiss many things we believe about history, like the existence of Socrates, we can't use the standard that's being proposed here. And I hope you like this video. I know I did. I liked filming it. It was fun. And I hope you would consider liking this channel and subscribing to this video to get more content like this. And thank you and God bless.